One serial killer is mostly remembered for two strange fetishes. Not only did he have a necrophilia, but he was also morbidly fascinated by women's shoes. Back in the late 1960s, Jerome Henry Brudos had a horrific murder spree in the Salem, Oregon area. He picked on petite, fragile-looking women, and the tortures he inflicted on the kidnapped or trapped women were horrifying. They would be strangled and beaten to death with blunt objects, and even after they were already dead, he would not leave them alone. Jerome would cut off their body parts as his trophies and dump those women in the local rivers. It's crazy how messed up Jerome is. In some cases, he even goes as far as to abduct and assault his victims while wearing women's clothing. Even after he was arrested, he didn't feel remorse for his crimes. Instead, he felt bad about getting caught. In one interview, a detective asked him, "Do you have any regrets? Do you feel sorry for the girls who died?" He just picked up a piece of paper, crumpled it into a ball, and threw it on the floor, saying, "I cared as much for those girls as I do for this ball of paper." Jerome was born in a hospital in Webster, South Dakota on January 31st, 1939, to a family that lived a simple and modest life. His father usually did temporary jobs, and his mother was a housewife. He had a rough childhood. His mom was a strict person, and he lacked love and approval. His mom wanted her second child to be a girl, but Jerome was a boy. She made no secret of her dislike for the youngest son, reserving most of her resentment and criticism for him. Jerome grew up with a close friendship with a female neighbor who was a little older than his mom. She was kind and showed him compassion and acceptance throughout the relationship, which helped him a lot. Jerome often imagined that this neighbor was his real mom. Unfortunately, this neighbor was diabetic, and as her health got worse, they stopped seeing each other. The real pain for this poor child was when he was saved by someone, but that person disappeared again. Jerome was obsessed with women's shoes and feet, but no one knew why. One time, when Jerome was 5, a teenage girl fell asleep in his bed, and he couldn't stop staring at her high heels. He tried to take her shoes off, and she got scared. Instead of yelling at him, she just told him to leave the room. Another time, Jerome found a pair of leather high heels with rhinestone inlays while exploring the local dump. He brought the shoes home and showed them to his mom in the heels and women's clothing, but his mom was disgusted and screamed for him to lose the heels, then beat him severely and burned the clothes. When he was 7 years old, he tried to steal his teacher's high heels, and when he was caught, he admitted to the theft but did not explain why he did it. Because of Jerome's dad's job, they moved around a lot. Eventually, they moved to Salem, Oregon, where Jerome was about 12 years old and well into puberty. But he hadn't changed at all, and he even developed a fetish for women's underwear. Jerome said a neighborhood boy took him to touch and smell some girl's underwear, and that's why he did it. Women's shoes and lingerie had already turned Jerome on, but his height and severe acne made him very self-conscious and shy around women. At 14, he started masturbating to porn mags and often had dreams about women. When his mom found semen stains on his bed, he was punished and forced to wash the sheets. At 15, he started stalking young women in the area, taking quiet photos of several of them, and stealing and keeping many of the women's undergarments and shoes. Although none of these offenses were violent, it's clear that he developed violent fantasies of forcibly possessing women at this time. When he was 16, he started acting weird. He dug a tunnel under his house and made a little room in it. He did this because he had some kinky ideas about catching women, even though he didn't really keep anyone there. That is, until Jerome came up with a pattern of crime. He'd lure a neighbor girl into his bedroom under one pretext and then find an excuse to leave the room. A few minutes later, a masked, knife-wielding man forced the girl to strip naked and he took a bunch of pictures of her before running off. Then, a short time later, Jerome came back wearing a shirt with his hair a mess and a cut on his cheek. He told the girl that an intruder had locked him in the family barn with a knife. In the year after that, Jerome did it again and again, hurting a bunch of girls, but because they weren't physically or sexually assaulted and went into Jerome's bedroom on their own, no one told the police about it at the time. In April 1956, he persuaded a 17-year-old girl to accompany him on a date, and after driving her down a deserted road, he then ordered the girl to take off her clothes, but the girl refused, so infuriated, he dragged the girl out of the car and broke her nose. But luckily, the girl's screams caught the attention of a young couple driving by who stopped Jerome's behavior. The girl was hysterical that Jerome was trying to sexually assault her, and he lamely explained that the girl had accidentally fallen out of the car, and then went on to say that there was a strange weirdo who was trying to sexually assault the girl, and that he was just coming over to help. But there was clearly no credibility to the story, so the couple took them to a nearby police station. Once in the interrogation room, Jerome became very compliant and admitted to assaulting the girl, but his intent was only to get her to take off her clothes and take pictures of her, denying that he had done this type of behavior before. Jerome was arrested for assault and battery. Then the police found out during a search of his bedroom that Jerome had a large collection of women's clothing as well as a large number of real photographs taken of nude girls. The police contacted one of the girls and asked her why she had been photographed in these pictures. The girl revealed everything that had happened last year. And it was at this point that the police realized that this was not his first-time offender and that he had already harmed. More than one woman had been harmed. And because those girls were too young to tell their parents and the police about such things, nothing like this had happened. Then, Jerome was sent to the Polk County Juvenile Hall, where he was treated as a juvenile delinquent and sent to the Oregon State Hospital for a psychiatric evaluation on April 16, 1956. He stayed there for a total of 9 months. He underwent a series of psychiatric evaluations, and the tests concluded that Jerome was a depressed person suffering from schizotypal personality disorder. Psychologists also concluded that his sexual fantasies stemmed solely from his hatred of his mother. After Jerome got out of the hospital, he went back to living with his parents and graduated from Corvallis High School like a normal student in 1957. 2 years later, he joined the Army and trained as a communications technician. His comrades remembered him as a guy who only fantasized because he said he could have casual sex with a Korean girl and that the girl would quietly come to his bed every night. In October 1959, he was expelled from the Army because he had been tested and found psychologically unfit for military service. Jerome went back to his parents' place and got a job as an electrical engineer at a local radio station. His coworkers saw him as an outstanding, skilled, and dedicated employee with a mild-mannered demeanor. But even though he was a licensed technician, he didn't seem to have any idea of advancing his abilities. At this time, although Jerome had a good job, his mother did not change her mind in the least. She loathed Jerome and doted on her other son, and during the years he lived with his parents, he was allowed to sleep in his bedroom. But whenever his older brother came home, he was forced to sleep in a makeshift shed he had created at the back of the house. Around 1960, he kept up his stalking behavior. One time, Jerome saw a young woman dressed in revealing clothing, and he followed her to an apartment. In a dark stairwell, he covered the girl's mouth, and after a few minutes of struggling, she fell into a coma. He didn't sexually assault or beat her, just took the girl's shoes and ran away. On another occasion, Jerome saw another beautiful girl in high heels, and he tried to take the girl's shoes, as he had done on the previous occasion. However, the girl fought back, and he panicked and fled after getting only one of the heels. After about a year of working at a radio station in Corvallis, Jerome got to know a 17-year-old girl named Ralphine Schwindler. He met Schwindler through a teenage boy who was into electronics and often went to the radio station to watch and ask about Jerome's work. One day, Jerome said he wanted to find a girlfriend, and the boy agreed right away and took him to Schwindler's house. They got married on September 30th, 1961, when Schwindler was a month pregnant. At first, they lived in Portland, Oregon, and then in the summer of 1968, they moved to a small house in a suburb of Salem. They had 2 kids together, and Jerome sometimes helped repair vehicles in the family garage to make some extra money. He actually never mistreated his wife, but for the first few years of their marriage, he insisted that Schwindler walk around the house naked and do her chores in the same way. For several years, Schwindler went along with these strange habits until the mid-1960s, when Jerome's daughter was a toddler, and she rejected his strange habits to make sure her child developed properly. Jerome gained weight, and she said that even though she never told him, she was starting to be disgusted by how he was looking. She was still faithful to him, but they were interacting less and less. She was spending more time with her daughter and her female friends, and Jerome was spending more time working on the house or in his garage workshop. In May 1967, while Schwindler was in the hospital with her second child, Jerome followed a young woman in high heels to her home. He waited until nightfall, then went into her apartment and strangled the girl. He later said that when he first went into the house, he didn't plan to rape the girl, but seeing her lying there all pretty and vulnerable turned him on so much that he sexually assaulted her. Then, he took her high heels and left. The next year, he was arrested by Corvallis police on the grounds of the women's dorm at Oregon State University. He was charged with stealing women's clothing, and he was arrested by the police while still wearing high heels and women's underwear. Between 1968 and 1969, Jerome kidnapped and killed at least 4 young women and attempted to kidnap at least 2 others. After each victim was abducted, he would ask them to wear different underwear and shoes, and then he would take his camera and photograph the women. Linda Catherine Slauson, the first known victim, was from Aloha, Oregon. She was only 19 years old when she was murdered by Jerome. She was a saleswoman selling encyclopedias and had high hopes for the future. On January 26, 1968, Linda went to Jerome's yard. She talked to Jerome, who was working in the yard. She wanted to sell the encyclopedia she had with her. Jerome was acting normal. He invited Linda into the room and said he wanted to look over the encyclopedia with her, because there would be extra money for each copy sold, so Linda agreed to go into the room with him. As Linda sat on a stool and started her sales pitch, Jerome took out a wooden club and hit her in the head. Then he strangled her with his hands before dragging Linda's body to the basement of the house. He got his family to go out with his daughter to get burgers, cleaned up the blood, and then went down to the basement to get rid of Linda's body. He eagerly removed Linda's clothes and noticed her red lingerie, which aroused his desire. He repeatedly engaged in necrophilia, dressed Linda's body in different shoes and lingerie, and took numerous photographs. A few hours later, he took a hacksaw and severed Linda's left foot and stored it in a freezer, keeping Linda's encyclopedia as a souvenir. Then, he dumped her body somewhere in Marion County. Jan Susan Whitney, 23 years old, on November 26, 1968, her car broke down, so she had to stand on the side of the highway with her 3 friends and wait for help. Jerome was on his way home when he met the 4 young men. He kindly examined Whitney's car and claimed that he could fix it, but he asked the pretty young girl to come with him home to get the tools to fix the car. Whitney and her 3 friends agreed after a short discussion, and because of the long wait, 2 other friends chose to ride with Jerome because their homes were nearby and they wanted a ride. Jerome dropped the 2 off at their destination, and then he drove Whitney to his home, ostensibly to pick up the repair tools. But in reality, instead of doing that, he quietly went back to the back seat of the car because she was feeling so tired that she didn't notice exactly what Jerome was doing and put up little resistance before being strangled to death by Jerome with a leather luggage strap. He then carried her body to the garage where he sexually assaulted and humiliated her body. Most horrifically, Whitney was hung by him above the ceiling of the garage. And 2 days later, a car accidentally crashed into his garage. And then a police officer rushed to the scene and investigated the damage caused by the accident. But due to dust, debris, and the lack of lights, that police officer kept logging in outside of the garage while this victim's body was hanging from the ceiling inside the garage. Karen Elena Sprinker, an 18-year-old chemistry student at Oregon State University, had planned to go to lunch with her mother on the day of March 27, 1969, when she was abducted at gunpoint from the parking lot outside of the Mir and Frank department store by Jerome, who was dressed in a miniskirt and high heels and looking for a young woman dressed the same way as he was. Fortunately, he didn't find one, but unfortunately, Sprinker was abducted. According to Jerome, Sprinker kept begging him not to hurt her and said she'd do anything for him. Jerome then asked if she was a virgin, and she cried and said she was. She was on her period, and Jerome got so horny he forced the poor girl to take off her clothes and sexually assaulted her on the garage floor. Then, Sprinker was forced to pose in different lingerie and shoes for Jerome to take pictures. Nothing changed for Sprinker, even after she agreed to these demands. She was still bound by Jerome with her hands tied and a rope around her neck. After a few minutes, she, like Whitney, was suspended from the garage ceiling and died of asphyxiation. Over the next several hours, Jerome subjected her body to sexually degrading behavior and cut off her breasts. That night, Sprinker was dumped in the Willamette River. In April 1969, Jerome started acting more crazily and tried to kidnap 2 young women on back-to-back days. Luckily, both girls escaped and told the police about what happened. The first girl, Sharon Wood, a 24-year-old motorist, met Jerome on April 21st in an underground stairwell in a Portland parking garage. She said she felt a knocking motion on her shoulder, and when she turned around, all she saw was a man pointing a pistol at her face and ordering her not to scream. Wood bravely fought back, biting, kicking, and twisting his wrist to turn the gun away from her and toward him. She even bit his hand. This made Jerome angry, so he slammed her head on the concrete floor and ran away. The next day, 15-year-old schoolgirl Gloria Zhang Smith was forced at gunpoint to go with Jerome to a green Volkswagen. Jerome said, "I want you to come with me. I'm not going to hurt you. I'm not going to rape you." And then he grabbed Smith by the jacket and forced her to walk with him. When Smith saw a woman working on the lawn, she yelled and ran toward the woman, which caused Jerome to panic and flee the scene. Linda Dawn Saleh, a 22-year-old moving company secretary and part-time student at Portland State University in Beaverton, Oregon, was kidnapped on the afternoon of April 23, 1969, in the parking lot of a shopping center. Saleh, who had just bought slacks and a watch band from the mall and was going to give them to her fiancé as a birthday present, was approached by Jerome, who showed her a fake police badge and told her that she was under arrest for shoplifting. He said he was a cop, and even though Sally insisted she was innocent, she went with him to his car. There, Jerome threatened her and told her she had been kidnapped. He drove her to his house, where he made her follow him across the yard and into the basement. Just then, his wife came out to tell him that dinner was ready. Jerome told Sally that he'd be back soon and took her back to the garage, where he tied her up with a rope. Jerome went inside alone to have dinner with his family. When he got back to the garage, after finishing dinner, he saw that Sally had broken free and was trying to escape. He put a leash around her neck right away. Sally asked him why he was treating her this way, then started to claw and kick him. But women are not as strong as men, so she was strangled to death while he was sexually assaulting her. Eventually, her body was tortured and studied, and a day later, Sally's body was dumped in the Willamette River. On May 10, 1969, 2 fishermen found the body of a bound, bloated young woman wearing a jacket and pinned down by a big gearbox in the shallow waters of the Longtan River. Because the woman's body was so badly decomposed, the autopsy couldn't confirm whether or not she had been sexually assaulted, but it did confirm that the cause of death was strangulation. The autopsy also found traces of burns on her body, which was later that woman as Sally. 2 days later, an underwater search and rescue team found Sprinker's body about 20 yards from where Sally's body had been found. The autopsy showed that she had died from suffocation and her breasts were missing. The main thing linking the deaths of Sally and Sprinker to the same killer was that both young women were bound by the same brand of hot plate and both were tied up with car parts. This suggests that the killer may have had a background as an electrician or mechanic. To figure out where the car parts came from, the police talked to employees and owners of all the garages and junkyards in Western Oregon. After officially identifying the 2 women, the investigators also talked to their family members and friends. The police investigation into Sprinker's relationships revealed that, in recent months, several of the female students had received calls from a man claiming to be a military veteran who asked to take them on dates, but almost all of them refused, except for one, who, in a state of some kind of sympathy, she let the man take her on a date, and after being interviewed by the police, she described him as a white man in his late 20s or early 30s with thinning blonde hair and freckles, and his car was a dirty station wagon. That date was pretty rough, and the girl was pretty cautious because she remembered the 2 victims found in the river. When she got home, the man asked why she'd changed her mind and agreed to go with him. She said she was just curious, and he said, "How do you know I won't take you to the river and strangle you?" The girl really didn't want to go on any more dates with him, but the police asked her to let them know if he ever asked her out again. She agreed, and a week later, he did ask her out. Then the police arrested him at the agreed-upon meeting spot. Jerome gave the police his real name, age, and job, but a false address. There wasn't a good reason to detain him, so he was quickly released. Even though a background check showed a history of physical and sexual violence against women, and a search of the vehicle database revealed that he lived in the Portland area, where Linda was last seen alive, and after finding Brudos' real address, investigators found that a few blocks away from where he lived was the location of the department store where Sprinker was abducted. Also, while Jerome didn't own a Volkswagen, investigators found out that his mom did, and that he drove it on April 22nd, the day of Smith's attempted abduction. Smith said that Jerome was definitely the guy who tried to kidnap her. On May 26th, the cops searched Jerome's place and found a ton of women's underwear and shoes in his garage, lists of phone numbers for sorority and sorority women's living spaces, and a bunch of Polaroid pics of young women, some alive and some dead. Almost all of the photos were taken inside his garage, and several of them showed a dead woman hanging from a garage pulley. There was a mirror on the floor next to her, and in one photo you could see him holding his Polaroid camera. One of them was identified as Sprinker, and she was depicted standing nude with her face showing a severe expression of fear, contemplation, or apparent submissiveness. She was also wearing high-heeled flip-flops. A female breast was found on the mantelpiece in the living room. Police also found a coil of copper wire, the same type used to tie Sally's and Sprinker's bodies to engine parts before dumping them in the Longtan River, in addition to a bunch of engine parts scattered around the garage. On May 29th, as the murder investigation went on, investigators had enough evidence to link Jerome to the attempted abduction of Smith to arrest him. And the next night he called his wife and asked her to destroy any more incriminating evidence, but his wife refused. After his second arrest, he was questioned about the evidence found in his garage and his relationship with the missing and murdered young women. Investigators had identified 3 of these women as Whitney, Sprinker, and Saleh. Jerome initially denied any involvement in any of the cases, arguing that the evidence was circumstantial, but after a few days he began to gradually reveal his sexual fetishes and described how they were deeply ingrained in his psyche and daily life. By early June, Jerome had confessed to all 4 murders to the investigators and then described them to the police and psychologists. He started with Linda's murder, admitting that it was because of a pair of attractive high-heeled shoes the young woman was wearing when she accidentally came into his house to sell encyclopedias. Then he described each of his subsequent murders and attempted kidnappings in detail. Even though he admitted to being responsible for the murders, he didn't really give a full explanation of why he did it. He just said there must be something wrong with him. He said he didn't hate women, but he did kill them to deal with his emotions. On June 4th, Jerome was officially charged with the murders of Whitney, Sprinker, and Saleh. At his first court appearance, he pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity. After a bunch of doctors examined him, they all decided he was sane and could stand trial. Then, on June 27th, just 3 days before the trial was set to begin, he entered a formal plea of guilty to 3 counts of first-degree murder. This was done in front of a Marion County Circuit Court judge, and he was sentenced to 3 consecutive terms of life imprisonment, with the possibility of parole, to be served at the Oregon State Penitentiary. On August 7th, Schwindler was formally indicted for the first-degree murder of Sprinker, but these charges were based on the statement of an eyewitness who claimed to have seen Schwindler assisting Jerome in forcing a young woman under a blanket into their house on the day of Sprinker's disappearance. At the September trial, other witnesses refuted the eyewitness statement. The following month, Schwindler was found not guilty. After he was locked up, Jerome turned into a model inmate. In the 1970s, he was assigned clerical duties, using his electronic skills to maintain the prison's computerized record-keeping system and to install the cable television network. He was also trusted with the storage, repair, and maintenance of the prison's vending machines. As a convicted sex offender, he was physically assaulted a bunch of times by other inmates, all of whom he refused to name as his assailants. While he was in prison, Jerome went to a lot of parole hearings. His victims' families went to these hearings too, and they wanted him to stay in prison forever. On June 21, 1995, he found out that he was going to spend the rest of his life in prison. Jerome died of liver cancer in the Oregon State Penitentiary on March 28, 2006, at 5:10 a.m. He was 67 years old. He was the longest incarcerated inmate in the Oregon Department of Corrections, having served a total of nearly 37 years. When someone heard about Jerome's death, a family member of one of the victims spoke about how she felt. She said, "As soon as I heard he died, I started crying. It wasn't for him. It was for our family. He put our family through hell.